This is Ben Goertzel, and I'm going to tell you now about some work I've done with my colleagues at SingularityNET, connecting symbolic AI and uncertain logical reasoning-based AI on knowledge hypergraphs, in particular, with AI as done on numerical vectors, which is commonplace now in neural nets and machine learning. And the work I'm going to talk about is of broad interest. It's done as part of a research program to use the OpenCog engine to work toward true artificial general intelligence, and it's also being done as part of a research program to use OpenCog together with machine learning tools to understand the genomics of longevity. I mean, the same fundamental ideas and algorithms used here could be applied to a lot of other things besides longevity and to various narrow AI applications distinct from the pursuit of AGI. But it's been the combination of AGI R&D and bioinformatics of longevity R&D that's in practice been driving this work. So I mean, in particular, what we've been doing is curating a weighted labeled hypergraph, which in OpenCog is called an atom space, full of knowledge derived from various biological ontologies and derived from biology research papers and derived from the results of analyzing various genomic data sets. And this is a large atom space with a lot of different nodes and links. And we've been looking at using the deep walk algorithm in our own variation of it to embed nodes from this bioatom space knowledge graph into a vector space. And we've then been looking at various mappings between the geometry and topology of the atom space, the hypergraph representation, and the corresponding vectors. And for example, you can see under certain conditions, if two nodes are more similar, closer in the right sense in the atom space, then the embedding vectors are going to be more similar. And I mean, you can see that if you have an arrow between two vectors in the embedding space, then that can correspond to a sort of directed relationship called an intentional difference, like a directed property difference between the nodes and links in the knowledge hypergraph. So these correspondences, they're not sort of arbitrary correspondences between a graph and a bunch of embedding vectors. They're really correspondences between a knowledge hypergraph that has the particular probabilistic semantics associated with our probabilistic logic networks logic, correspondences between that and a hypergraph. But nevertheless, I think that's quite interesting. In a category theory sense, you could say we're building morphisms between the PLN probabilistic logic network semantic knowledge graph and the embedding vectors, between the algebra on the knowledge graph and the algebra of the embedding vectors. And in some other more general theoretical work on the foundations of AGI, I've posited that morphisms between different knowledge representations corresponding to different kinds of learning and reasoning algorithms are critical to how intelligent minds under limited resources can achieve what you'd call cognitive synergy, meaning that when one AI algorithm associated with a certain type of memory or goal runs into a bottleneck, another one can help it out. And for cognitive synergy between different cognitive algorithms to really work, the algorithms need to be able to access each other's internal representations in a meaningful way. So like when a logic engine gets stuck, if it wants to rely on a vector method to help it get unstuck, the vector method has to be able to make sense of the internal representations of the logic engine, and vice versa. If a vector analysis AI method gets stuck, if a logic engine is going to help it out, the logic engine has to be able to make sense of the internal representations used by the vector-based AI method. And having morphisms between the internal representations in the logic engine and the vectors, I mean, this allows logic-based and vector-based AI to cooperate together, including help each other out when they get stuck, which is cognitive synergy that I've posited to be a key feature of building a multi-algorithm AGI system. So I'm not going to go into the grand AGI theory too much in this talk, but I want to allude to that because that's part of why this is interesting to me. I mean, the other parts being because the application area of longevity genomics is interesting, and I mean, these are also just cool algorithmic and mathematical relationships on their own. So to make this a little bit more concrete, so here's some scheme code from the OpenCog system scheme shell, which shows a very short, simple inference done by the PLN engine on the bioatom space. So here, the situation was, so the gene ITPR3 was observed to have increased gene expression in very old people. But why? The machine learning algorithm, the Moses, OpenCog's probabilistic evolutionary program learning algorithm in this case, tells you that, okay, in many of the little classification rules Moses learns that distinguish very old people from other people, in many of these rules, this gene ITPR3 plays a key role in these rules in combination of other genes, but that doesn't give you an explanatory model. So what PLN figured out is, well, okay, one factor is this gene has many similar properties to another gene, FCGR2B, and okay, that gene also belongs to the gene ontology category 50794, which is similar to another gene ontology category 30889, which is related to aging. So it's related to FCGR2B gene that has increased gene expression in aged individuals. It's related to a gene ontology that's similar to a gene ontology known to be related to aging. So PLN connects all these dots, right? And this is a very short inference, so PLN now can find it with no problem. But what we need to do is find more and more complex inferences that connect many more dots between different biological pathways, between data in one organism and another organism, or one experiment and another experiment. And to do these more complex inferences, PLN, like all logic engines, can take a very long time because it has many, many, many possible logical inferences to explore. So this is one case where cognitive synergy between logical and vector-based methods could play a role. If you could project the nodes and links involved in a logical inference into a vector space, and then use something in the vector space to help you figure out what direction the logical inference should go in, then you're cutting through the combinatorial explosions in logical inference. And on the other hand, on the vector side, if you could use the knowledge graph to make concise, compact feature vectors to feed into neural nets and XGBoost and other vector-based learning algorithms, I mean, then the reasoning in the logical side is helping out on the vector side by creating more meaningful compacted vectors. So you can have the vector side helping the logic side and vice versa. And we're going to demonstrate, how and why that works. So the key technical thing that we'll be doing to connect the logic side to the vector side is running the deep walk algorithm, which is not our invention. It's been used before, but mostly on the social network graphs. We've been using the deep walk algorithm to embed the nodes and links in our knowledge hypergraph into numerical vectors. And the core idea here is pretty simple, would make sense to anyone who's familiar with word2vec. I mean, what word2vec does is it takes a whole bunch of text and it creates an embedding vector for each word based on what other words occur before and after that word in the various instances. Not necessarily immediately before and after the word, but in some neighborhood around that word. What we do in deep walk is, for each node in a graph, we take a whole bunch of walks that are walks through the graph that pass through that node. And then we treat that collection of walks as if it was a bunch of sentences in some language, and then do word2vec-like stuff to come up with embedding vectors for the nodes based on what other nodes neighbor them in the walks through the graph. So it's a nice, simple idea, basically repurposing word2vec and other word2vec-like algorithms for graphs rather than textual corpora or sequences. And I mean, as we find out, there's a bunch of things you have to pay attention to get that to work well, but it does work. And you can see at the right of this slide here some examples of paths, which is just sequences of nodes that can be followed through the bioatom space. Of course, the naming conventions in biology are confusing. The nodes beginning with a GO are gene ontology categories, which are, biological processes, molecular structures, and so forth. Then something like OXNAD1 is a gene name you can see there. Then there's some predicates, like a gene ontology term is logically inherited from something, or interacts with, which says two genes or proteins interact with each other. Whatever is in the bioatom space, you can put into a path. And of course, a path is very crude. If you have a weighted labeled hypergraph where the nodes and links have a particular semantics, just taking a path is throwing out a lot of the logical meaning there. On the other hand, having so many different paths, some of that logical meaning in a way comes back in the statistics of looking at all the different paths together. So one thing you can do here is look at geometric correspondences between the nodes in the hypergraph and the vectors. So on this graph, each dot is a pair of nodes from the OpenCog bioatom space. It's a pair of nodes representing gene ontology categories, where a gene ontology category could be a biological process like, say, apoptosis or T-cell differentiation. So each dot is a pair of two gene ontology category nodes, and on the y-axis what you have is just the distance between the embedding vectors that deep walk assigned to those nodes. What you have on the x-axis is a little subtler. You have a measure of the difference between those nodes in the atom space, and there would be a lot of ways to do that. I mean, you could just look at how far apart are the two nodes in the atom space, like are they right next to each other, or are they 5 nodes away from each other? But that would be very crude, because I mean the nodes and links in the atom space have particular meanings, and they have weights on them, like probabilistic truth values, strength and confidence values. So we wanted a measure of the difference in the atom space that actually took into account the semantics of the nodes and links in the atom space. So what you can do there, you can calculate what's called the intensional difference, and that's the difference of properties. So for each node, you construct a fuzzy set of all the properties of that node that are represented in the atom space hypergraph, which are, each property is weighted by how much information it gives about that node. And then you know the properties of one node, the properties of another node, the fuzzy set of properties of one and the other. And then you look at the fuzzy set symmetric difference between the fuzzy property sets of the two nodes. And that basically, suitably normalized, gives you the intensional difference between the two nodes. And what we see here is mostly a vaguely linear correlation. Now, when the intensional difference, as we were measuring it, is 1 or very close to 1, that means the two nodes basically have no properties in common. And what you see in this graph is when the nodes have no properties in common, or almost no properties in common, then the vector distance could be anything. Like that, then the embedding is not putting them all far apart, it's putting some close, some far. But when the intensional difference is away from 0, so the nodes have some properties in common, then you have a vaguely, linear-ish increasing relationship between the intensional different distance and the vector distance, which it makes sense because the embedding vectors deep walk is giving you are supposed to be, they're supposed to denote the properties of the node, which is what the intensional difference is looking at. So that was nice, and it shows a sort of geometric morphism or mapping between the vector world and the logic world. And biology is always a bit messy, so we tried out something similar on a different atom space, just full of data about students in a massive online course, a MOOC, and there you see a much more simple linear relationship, because this MOOC atom space is just a bit less messy, same exact algorithm. So the fact that on a sort of crisper, less messy atom space, which is also of less fundamental interest, but of a crisp, less messy atom space, you get a nicer correlation between vector of distance and logical distance. That gives us some faith that the rough correlation we see in the biology atom space is not just noise. So that's one correspondence. Now I want to talk about a subtler correspondence of sort of aligning differences in the logical space with differences in the vectorial space. So if you look at the notation on this slide, if you have a gene ontology category node called like B cell differentiation, just the process of a B cell, which is kind of immune cell differentiating, call V of B cell differentiation the embedding vector deep walk produces from that gene ontology node in the atom space. So what you find is some vector arithmetic. You find vector for B cell differentiation minus the vector for T cell differentiation. That's roughly the same as the vector for B cell proliferation minus the vector for T cell proliferation. So differentiation, the cells dividing in two; proliferation, the cells reproducing and spreading all over the place. They're different processes, but we see these correspondences. And this is much like, the word to vec correspondence, like king minus queen equals man minus woman. These correspondences are not at all surprising if you look at how the vectors are created. I mean, the vectors are sort of compressed property lists. So, I mean, the properties that a man has but a woman doesn't have are a lot of the same ones as the properties that a king doesn't have and a queen doesn't have. And similarly, the properties B cell differentiation has but T cell differentiation doesn't. A lot of them are the same as the properties B cell proliferation has and T cell proliferation doesn't, because they're the properties of B versus T cells, right? And B and T cells are quite different in nature. What we find is when you have this sort of correspondence between the vectors, you can find a similar correspondence between the intentional differences in the PLN logic. The intentional difference is basically the set of properties that are in, say, B cell differentiation node's fuzzy property set, but not T cell differentiation concept node's fuzzy property set. So then you see the intentional difference of B cell differentiation and T cell differentiation is quite similar to the intentional difference between B cell proliferation and T cell proliferation, right? And I mean that's again, it's what you would hope for, but you don't always get what you hope for. And so far, we've validated this in many different cases, but it doesn't hold in every case. And we're currently trying to characterize, when you get this alignment, this correspondence of differences. And this graph sort of shows that alignment pictorially. I mean, what you have is that vector between B cell diff and B cell prolif is pointing the same direction as the vector T cell diff minus T cell prolif, and that corresponds to rough equivalence between these intentional differences between fuzzy property sets. So quite elegant, and what we're working on now is using this to guide inference. So you want to get from certain logical premises to logical conclusions. Say the conclusion you want to understand is, so why would it be that, say, this particular gene or combination of genes or gene variations is involved with longevity? Maybe the premises are, a particular biological data set or a particular knowledge base, and you want to see, will this conclusion about the causes of the correlates of longevity, will it follow from this body of biological knowledge? So one thing you can then do, you can do a vector embedding in the premises, vector embedding of the conclusions, draw the arrow between the embedding in the premises and embedding in the conclusions. Then the the nodes along that arrow, you can try as intermediate steps in logical reasoning to get from the premises to the conclusions. And this is quite interesting, and it's what we're currently working on. And the other thing we're working on, which I don't have a slide for, which is the reverse, right? So you can take the embedding vector for a gene, say get a 100-dimensional vector for a gene, and if you're doing some classification problem on genes, then you can use the embedding vector for a gene as the input to a neural net algorithm. Or if you're doing a clinical trial analysis, you're trying to figure out why some people are cured of COVID by a certain drug and others aren't. Well, you feed in information about all the patients and their genomics, and then all this general knowledge about genomics and genes and pathways and bodies. You get an embedding vector for each person from the atom space, and then you do the supervised classification problem of people who this drug helped with their COVID, people who this drug didn't help with their COVID. You do that classification problem on the embedding vectors that were gotten by embedding the nodes corresponding to those people in the atom space into a vector space. So you can use the vector difference to guide reasoning in the logical space, and you can use the vectors as sort of compressed property vectors to input to neural nets or other learning algorithms on the vector side. And this is it's a real life example of cognitive synergy between logic in the weighted labeled hypergraph and vector distances and vector arithmetic and all these vector manipulations that are used in standard vector-based machine learning. So, I mean, this is work that's ongoing now. It's further ahead now than when we submitted the conference paper, and it'll be further ahead a couple months from now. But I think this is an example of the direction that AI needs to go in now. I mean, vector-based AI embeddings, neural nets, both deep ones and shallow ones like you have in Word2Vec. I mean, these are very interesting, very important, but there's a certain level of abstraction and understanding that symbolic AI does way better, but it doesn't need to be either or. You can connect the vector-based AI with the symbolic AI, but you can't just connect them naively. You need to connect them in a way where there are morphisms that preserve the key symmetries and structures on either side. And that's all I have.